Biso Batetela, tozana centre de vrai congolais.
Basonge bazaba Kasai. Bazaba Luba te.
Ngai naza Luba 100%. Biso baluba pe toza Batetela.
Biso Batetela, tozana centre de vrai congolais.
Oyo mutombo, oyo kasongo.
Elonye sala bongo bat ba vandika landa ba ebika ka Basonge bazaba Luba.
Biso Batetela, tozana centre de vrai congolais.
Mbote kombo na ngai Paul Kalema pena kasongo. Naza mutetela.
Baluba.
Toza baluba, toza basonge, toza batetela. Biso tango toyaka Kishasa ponga na koma na Kishasa na âge à 3 ans.
OK.
Donc c'est que ceux qui Moluba a eu problème, c'est que ngai mutetela naza concerné directement.
OK.
Baluba.
Parce que oh babengi musongi na Kishasa bazo benga ye Moluba.
OK. Bozaba ndeko
Awa na
penza.
Kishasa. Donc tozalaka ndenge wana. Luba ubyoza musongo ubyoza mutetela biso nyonso toza na Kasai.
Baluba.
Eza batu mususu bayebi pe ko comprendre te qui est mutetele qui est muluba.
C'est Batetela pe bazaba Kasai. Mais bozaba Luba te.
Na Kasai oriental. De vrai congolais.
Baye Mutetela na muluba baze iloko moko.
Merci.
Eda Basonge. Bazana Katanga, territoire mobimba ya Kongolo. Eda Basonge. Bazana Kasai oriental, bazana Kasai occidental.
Ngai naza Luba 100%. Eza ndenge moko na bango bazolia loso me baza baluba. Baza batwa Kasai oriental.
Biso Batetela, tozana centre de vrai congolais.
Baluba.
Na Kasai oriental. De vrai congolais.
For those who watched parts 1 to 7 may now understand Kasai's ethnic categories can end up being utilized in a way that is problematic, misleading or inaccurate, especially when there's a desire to disregard history and geography. Let's go back to the early 20th century, West Kasai in Luebo. If you recall, I explained this is where one of the nucleus of the Shiluba language spread. At this time, Shiluba was placed onto paper material for the Bible and the translations. In Luebo, there was another American missionary who entered around 1911, which was around the same time missionaries were transferring Shiluba speakers to Lusambo in the Tetela's Sankuru district. The American missionaries' work concerned the study of a Konda language and Shiluba, which was strange considering Luebo was formed as a so-called Bakuba and Shiluba-speaking homeland. The American missionary was conducting interviews amongst uprooted and ex-enslaved people referred to as Baluba at Luebo. It becomes more strange when it is understood one of these interviewees included a Konda-speaking man, which in today's case would be a so-called Batetela man. This implies there were also so-called Batetela who were taken to Luebo from East Kasai, thus meaning they would have been loyal to the invading Europeans. This could also have resulted in some people who originate from Konda-speaking populations being categorized as Baluba, and you will understand further as I continue. The name of the ex-enslaved interviewee was Mudimbi. Mudimbi is a name found amongst so-called Batetela and Songe, who reside in the Lomami district up to the eastern ends within the Sankuru district towards Manyema. The enslaved Konda-speaking and Songe populations within these regions usually had holes pierced into their ear, and the women would have an additional hole pierced into their nose. These piercings were ritualistically performed by the invading Sultan Swahili slavers, and the piercing became a marker for one who is owned by the Sambala or Bangwana. Within the American missionary school at Luebo, it would be possible the populations who did not come from the Luba or Lunda kingdom were taught Shiluba. Considering it has been documented, there has been attempts to implement Shiluba into the Tetela Sankuru district from the same missionaries involved in the Luebo missions in West Kasai. There is a strong chance Kete, Konda and Bashilange populations placed in Luebo were being collectively categorized as Baluba slaves and would have been speaking Shiluba at the missionary schools prior to being transported to Lusambo. American and European missionaries more than likely discovered Konda speaking populations who did not speak Shiluba but another Luba language, closer to Kiluba, and this language would have developed around the 18th century or shortly before. Along with some Songe and Baluba homeland populations, some of these Luba-speaking Konda people would have been enslaved by the Sultan Swahili Arabs in the mid-19th century, considering they were located near Kasongo homeland. During the course of time, they ended up being placed in the Lomami district by the Sultan Swahili Arabs, and they went on to settle in a place they named Malela. These populations became known as Sungu and Malela, and were also referenced as Batetela, despite the group including a mixture of Baluba Songe populations. This short story is highlighted so we can understand some of these populations would have had holes pierced in their ears, considering the region they came from and considering some of them were Arabized. When Shiluba-speaking populations were planted within the Tetela's Sankuru district in Lusambo, it may have included Konda-speaking populations who spoke Shiluba and Konda-speaking populations who spoke another form of Kiluba. Hence, one Batetela group were called Sungu, which is a name that radiates from the Baluba homeland. For those who watch part 7, may notice this image captioned as a Baluba man holding a ceremonial adzi. If you look on the right hand side, the style of this adzi closer resembles that of a Konda speaking group known as Lemba. Further to this, ceremonial adzis attributed to Baluba as an ethnic group appear to be exclusive to the Baluba homeland in Kananga. This can only mean this image was not of a Luba but of a Konda speaking person who was captioned as a Baluba. Considering within this early 20th century Lusambo, Shiluba and a form of Kiluba would have been known amongst some Konda speaking populations. This may have been a contributing factor to why the Europeans captioned the photo as Baluba, especially if they were being loyal to the invading Europeans. Another notable Lusambo image is an image of a young woman with a nose and an ear pierce who was undoubtedly of a Konda speaking population, considering the ear pierce and the nose pierce, which was a sign of one that was Arabized within the Manyema regions up to the eastern sides of the Sankuru district and the Lomami district. If this statement is too strong, we should look into the history of the photo. The staff who managed the archives presents the photo as a Lusambo Baluba girl. Further to this, despite the photo being taken within today's Sankuru district, the archive staff titled the photo as a Luba countryside when they were within Tetela country. Consider 1950s to 1970s historians amplified Baluba Kasai homeland, ranging from the Ngandazika regions up to Mbuji, which is south of Lusambo. Also, the notes attached to this photo provides a quote from an invading European missionary who outlines the name Baluba can be applied to any enslaved person, and this term was generally used by white men. Applying this quote to the photo notes is self-admittance this young woman is not Luba Kasai. However, this photo had since been presented as a Luba Kasai woman in reference to Luba Kasai populations being enslaved by Arabs. This whole story shows the invading Europeans had also used images to regulate ethnic categories, especially when it's concerned what they deem as prestige or loyal. There are several other cases of misrepresentation showing so-called Bakuba being presented as Baluba and Basonge being presented as Batetela and Sambala being presented as Batetela. Konda-speaking forest populations were one of the first populations to have images taken of them as far as the late 19th century, and some of these images were deliberately held back during the time the so-called Batetela were revolting. When some of the forest Tetela images reappeared nearly a decade later, some of the Batetela captions were removed. Also, before they reappeared, some of the ethnographic material were of Songe or Sambala, captioned as Batetela, which conflicted with the earlier presentation as Batetela savages of the 19th century. Within Konda-speaking communities, pierced noses and ears was a mark to identify a Konda-speaking person who was enslaved by the Sultan Swahili Arabs. Those who turned this practice into fashion after the 20th century were despised, which I'm sure would lead to some so-called Batetela being loyal to the Europeans, thus synchronizing with the despised narrative that was attached to the Baluba Jews presentation. These dynamics would later evolve into Forest Tetela against what they call the Sambalas, who were planted on their savannas by invading Europeans to act as plantation watchmen. In summary, you may notice what we know today as Luba Kasai was unclear or unrepresented within this period. This is due to the fact Europeans either strategically or loosely used the term Baluba, which means some of the presentations of Baluba at Luebo may not have been what we know today as Baluba Kasai. Do note, most of the Baluba in reference to Baluba Kasai would have been in West Kasai, but it becomes more problematic as most of the images are of so-called Lulua populations, if not Bakete or so-called Kuba populations. For this reason, I am again directed to look closer to the Lunda Kingdom regions, as some of these early phenotypical Baluba descriptions, though exaggerated, they fit the phenotypical descriptions of the Lunda Kingdom notables. In part 7, I claimed the spread of Shiluba north of the Lunda Kingdom towards the Lulua river regions in West Kasai. We will go back to this region in search of iconography used to identify Baluba Kasai. Stay tuned for part 9 entitled Scars to Prove It.